Today's story is Mighty Joe Magarac. In western Pennsylvania, on the banks of three mighty rivers, lies the steel town of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was once the steel capital of the world. It was home to mighty steel mills and the mighty steel workers who worked the steel that built this great nation. Of all the mighty steel workers in Pennsylvania, the mightiest and most memorable was Joe Magarac. Sometime in the 1930s, or so the steelworkers say, young Joe sprouted up full grown from the iron ore in the Pennsylvania hills. He was literally made of steel. A giant of a man, he towered over the other steelworkers like a colossal steel crane. Young Joe reported for work at the Pittsburgh steel mills. He worked longer and harder than any steelworker ever had worked. In fact, they say Joe made steel 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Joe could bend steel beams with his bare hands. He could dip his hands into pots of molten steel, scoop up the boiling metal, and pour it into the molds. The sight horrified the other steel workers. They were afraid for Joe. But how can you hurt a man of steel? They might think a giant steel man would be an outcast, not liked by any of the folks around him. But Joe was a hero to the steel workers. One time a huge pot of melted steel broke loose from the giant chains high above the mill floor. Before anybody could yell, "Watch out," Joe caught the immense melting pot just before it landed on 50 workers below. In the 1940s, there was a shortage of ships. The country needed many new ones, and they needed them fast. Joe Magarac got busy. He worked double, then triple speed. In just 1 week, Joe made enough steel to build a whole new seafaring fleet. Joe bundled up all the steel with a big chain and carried it to the shipyards on the eastern seaboard. Then he helped with the shipbuilding. In fact, he built a whole battleship by himself in one night. But all the work near the tidal waters wasn't good for poor Joe. Sadly, the salt water from the foaming Atlantic Ocean rusted his joints. Soon Joe was in terrible condition. His mighty steel body had betrayed him. Back in Pittsburgh, the steel workers heard that Joe had a yearning to return home. So they built a special railroad car just to carry Joe home. It was as long as a football field with a vast, flat bed for Joe. It took 10 steam engines to pull it. When Joe saw it, he almost cried with joy. Of course, he had to stop before he rested his eyes shut. Joe lay down on the railroad car and rode home to Pittsburgh in style. The steel workers greeted him with cheers. They needed Joe's help in the mills. But by this time, Joe's working days were over. After fixing his tired joints, Joe disappeared back into the hills where he came from, and no one ever heard or saw him again. Okay, listen to the story as many times as you need to. Then go ahead and click the link in Google Classroom to the Google quiz and take the comprehension questions. Good luck.